On today's video, we're going to go through sighting in our crossbow with a crossbow scope. Hey there, outdoor YouTubers. Well, like I said earlier, today's video is about sighting in our crossbows that have crossbow scopes on them. We want to make sure that they're shooting good and accurate for the upcoming hunting season. So, what is a crossbow scope? A crossbow scope has several lines inside of it. These lines inside the scope are called reticles or crosshairs. The horizontal lines are the elevation or the up-down, and the vertical line is the windage or the left to right. These different elevation lines actually form different crosshairs on the scope. Now, some crossbow scopes actually have small circles that are used instead of crosshairs, but I think you know what I'm getting at. These different lines of elevation are meant to be used for shooting at different distances. The uppermost elevation line on that crossbow scope is meant to be used when you're shooting at game or targets that are closer to you, and as you move down, each line of elevation is meant to be shot at a target or game that are slightly further out. When you're aiming with these crosshairs in your crossbow scope, as you're working your way down to the lower crosshairs, you're actually raising the trajectory of your crossbow, and that's meant to compensate for the drop of your arrow when you're shooting at targets that are further out. But don't get too bogged down with all these different lines of elevation inside your crossbow scope. Depending on how you hunt, you may only actually use possibly one set of crosshairs or maybe two anyways. So, like I said, don't worry about it too much, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more later on in the video. Now, before we do any shooting with the crossbow, we want to make sure that this scope is mounted nice and level in relationship to the crossbow itself, okay? Those horizontal lines of elevation inside the crossbow scope, we want them to be nice and parallel to the limbs of the crossbow. If this crossbow scope isn't mounted nice and level in comparison to the crossbow itself, that's going to cause us a lot of problems as we're sighting in. All right, so if you're looking through the scope and it doesn't seem like it's nice and parallel, nice and level compared to the crossbow, loosen up these scope mounts, okay? Turn it a little bit one way or the other, get it nice and level, and tighten it down. Another thing that you may want to adjust with your crossbow scope is the forward or backward positioning of it as you're looking through it when you're shooting. When you shoulder your crossbow and look through it as you're getting ready to shoot, you want to be able to see a good, full, clear circle through that scope. You don't want to see like a small little circle with a bunch of black around it. You don't want to see a small circle kind of everywhere inside the scope. You want to see the full, clear view as you're looking through that scope. If you don't see that good, clear, full circle inside the scope, you may have to adjust the scope forward or back to get that cleaned up. So once you get the scope mounted up in a good position, make sure everything's tightened down real good. Now we're all set to start shooting our crossbow. Now, when you're sighting in a crossbow, I highly recommend that you shoot from some kind of a rest. Even if you're going to be shooting freehand when you're out hunting, we still want to use a rest while we're sighting in. A rest gives us more consistency and it'll get us sighted in much quicker. Now, shooting a crossbow from a rest is much different than shooting a rifle from a rest. A crossbow has a lot of moving parts when you shoot it. The string comes forward. The limbs spring open, either forward or reverse, depending on the model crossbow you have. So you have to make sure whatever rest that you're shooting from does not impede any of these movements, or bad things are going to happen. Now, I've shot crossbows off of sandbags, corn sacks, and I've actually shot them off actual rifle rests. But even shooting a crossbow from a steady table or platform is much better than shooting freehand, especially when you're sighting in. Now, if I'm sighting in this crossbow and scope for the first time, I want those first few shots to be at something like 5 or 6 yards. Because I don't know how far off this setup might be, and I don't want to miss the target. If I miss the target, I'm probably going to ruin an arrow, and I'm not really going to get any kind of good information as far as making adjustments to the scope either. Now, initially, as we're sighting in the crossbow scope, we're going to be at a really close distance. So we're definitely going to want to be using that uppermost horizontal elevation line as our crosshairs. Now, if I take a few shots at close range and I'm shooting pretty close to the bullseye, I'll go ahead and I'll move that target out to 10 or 15 yards and start shooting at that distance. But if I'm barely hitting the target at, say, 6 yards, I'm going to want to make some adjustments before I shoot at any further distances. So either scenario, whether we're shooting at 6 yards or we're shooting at 15 yards, if we're not coming close to the bullseye, we're going to need to make adjustments. So let's say I take 3 shots and they are all consistently 5 to 6 inches high of the bullseye. Well, in that scenario, we're definitely going to want to make some adjustments to the scope. Now, if we're not shooting good, tight groups, we really can't make adjustments. If one shot is high, one shot is low, one shot is to the right, we really don't have any idea what kind of adjustments we could even make at that point. So if you're not shooting good, tight groups, you're going to need to practice more. You're going to have to make sure that nothing is loose on your crossbow or scope. You're going to have to make sure that all your arrows are the same size, the same weight, that they're nice and straight, that the fletchings are in good shape. And also make sure that you're shooting all the same size and type field tips or broadheads. So no adjusting the scope until we're shooting nice, tight, consistent groups. Now, before we get into making scope adjustments, I'd like to take a quick time out with a word from Camaro's Crawlers. Hey deer hunters, do you plan on shooting that big buck this fall? Well, if you do, be sure to stop by Camaro's Crawlers and check out their full selection of gutting gloves. Camaro's Crawlers has all your hunting needs covered. Okay, so back to us shooting consistently 5 to 6 inches higher than the bullseye or higher than the point we're aiming at. So to make adjustments for our up, down, or elevation of where we're hitting, we want to go to this top adjustment screw or adjustment knob on our crossbow scope. Unscrew the cover and there will be this adjustment screw or knob, and there will be some sort of an arrow indication that lets you know which way you would turn it to raise or lower the point of impact. So in our case, we're going to want to lower the point of impact, that 5 or 6 inches, to get our arrows hitting into the bull. So we're going to want to turn that screw or knob in the direction that indicates lowering that point of impact. Now, as you turn these adjustment screws, you can feel or hear segmented clicks with each slight movement of the adjustment screw. Pay attention to these clicks as you're adjusting the scope. Always count the number of clicks each time you make an adjustment. Some crossbows will give you a distance per click that the point of impact is supposed to change. This particular scope says that 1 click equals 1/2 inch of change in the point of impact at 100 yards? Well, generally speaking, these are just going to be rough estimates. The scope doesn't know the speed of your bow, it doesn't know the size or weight of your arrows, and quite honestly, a lot of crossbow shooters are not really shooting out to 100 yards anyways. So the reality of it is there's going to be a little bit of trial and error initially when you're trying to figure out how much distance changes on your point of impact per click. Okay, so I want to move that point of impact down 5 or 6 inches so those arrows are landing right in the bow. So I'm going to go to that top scope adjustment and I'm going to turn that screw or knob probably 20 clicks in the down direction, and then I'm going to take a few more shots. So let's say after I make the adjustments, I take 3 more shots and I've got a good group that's only about 3 inches higher than the bullseye now. Well, at that point it makes perfect sense to go ahead and adjust that scope down another 20 clicks, and that should put us right into the bull. And then you might want to make a mental note that 20 clicks moved your point of impact about 3 inches. Okay, that's going to help us out in the future, and maybe that's going to help us out if we decide to make any adjustments from side to side too. So now we're shooting good groups at 15 yards, but before we go any further, I do want to offer up one alternative method that maybe helps you get your crossbow in the ballpark before you even shoot it. And what I'm talking about here is a crossbow bore sighter. It's just this shaft with a laser that you can turn on. That laser shoots out the front of this shaft, and what you do is you just take this laser crossbow bore sighter and you stick it on your crossbow rail underneath the string. You turn the laser on and you want to kind of get it on kind of a good steady rest, and you put that laser light right on the bullseye. Okay, put it right on the bullseye. I would suggest 15, maybe 20 yards. Get it right on the bullseye and then look through the scope. And as you're looking through the scope, make sure that laser light is right on the bullseye. Ideally, you want to see that uppermost crosshair be right on the bullseye too. If not, you can make adjustments to the scope that'll bring those crosshairs right in, get the crosshairs right over the bull at the same time that that laser light is on the bull, and then you should kind of be in the ballpark. Okay, so that's just an alternative method that'll maybe, get you a little closer, save you a few shots as you're sighting in your crossbow. Now, having said all that, if for some reason you mount your scope, and whether you use the laser bore sight or not, you take a shot and boom, you're right in the bullseye, right off the bat, okay? You don't want to just be good with that, right? You want to be very familiar with your equipment. You want to take several shots, make sure that you're consistently in the bull, that sort of thing, okay? So when I talk about, doing it quicker or saving you some shots, those are all good things, but make sure that you are always taking enough shots where you're very comfortable with your equipment. So let's go with another scenario. Okay, we're hitting our target real good at short distances. So let's move the target out to 20 yards, and let's go ahead and we're still going to use that highest most crosshair, and we're going to go ahead and take a few more shots. And let's say now our group is consistently 2 to 3 inches to the left. All right, and remember, when we were doing that elevation adjustment, it seemed like about 20 clicks equaled about 3 inches of movement on the point of impact. So we want to move that point of impact to the right. Our arrows are coming in about 3-4 inches to the left, so we want to move that over to the right. So now we'll go to the side adjustment on our crossbow scope, which is the left-right or windage adjustment, and we're going to move that 20 clicks in the right direction. This particular scope shows an arrow with an L. So if you turn that particular adjustment screw or knob in that direction, it will move the point of impact to the left. We want to go to the right, so we're going to turn that the opposite direction. This should get us real close, but if we're still a little bit off one way or the other, just make the appropriate adjustments until you're dead on right in the bull. Some crossbow scopes actually have an adjustment knob on the side of the scope that's for lighted reticles, but it should be pretty obvious which side adjustment is for adjusting the scope and which one is for lighting the reticles. Now, if the groups you're shooting are so consistently tight and close together that your arrows are hitting each other in the target, go ahead and pick out a couple different bullseye spots and shoot at the different ones each time so you're not wrecking your arrows. Now, most modern crossbows will shoot pretty darn flat out to 20 or 25 yards. So if you're sighted in, say, at 20 yards, everything less than 20 yards should be good and accurate too. So probably the next thing that we want to experiment and find out about our crossbow is how far does our crossbow shoot flat? So let's move that target out to 25 yards and use that same highest crosshair elevation and see where we're hitting. So if you're still getting really good consistent groups in the bullseye at 25 yards, hey, that's great. Obviously, you don't need to make any adjustments there. But if the group is starting to come in kind of low at this distance, you may need to aim with that next lower crosshair on your crossbow scope. And the same goes for putting the target out even further and using the subsequent lower crosshairs as the target gets further and further out. You'll just kind of need to experiment with this and see what crosshairs are accurate at what distances on your setup. And one thing to remember, guys, if you plan on shooting game at all these different distances with all these different crosshair elevations, you're also going to need to be able to judge these distances out in the field to know that you're using the proper crosshair. Now, there are many things to consider when deciding how far out you might take a shot at an animal when you're out hunting. And I did do an entire video just on this subject, and I'll leave a link below in the description of this video if you want to kind of check that out. Okay, so we've been shooting the crossbow and we're very comfortable with all the different crosshair elevations and the shooting distance that they represent. But there's just a couple more things to keep in mind. If this whole time you've been using practice tips or field tips as you've been sighting in, but you plan on going out in the field and hunting with broadheads, make sure that you practice with those broadheads. And I can't stress that enough. It is very important to practice with your broadheads. Now, some broadheads will fly the same as the practice tips or field tips, but some will not. Even the mechanical expandable broadheads, they can fly slightly different than field tips. So we're definitely going to want to take a few shots with our broadheads, make sure everything's the same and everything is still accurate with those broadheads. Another thing to consider is if you are hunting from an elevated platform, you want to make sure that you are still sighted in from this same elevation. Gravity has less of an effect on your arrow flight when you're shooting downward. And conversely, when you're shooting on flat ground, gravity has more effect on the arrow flight. It really depends on the distance that you're shooting and the equipment that you're using. Hey guys, well, I hope some of these tips help you out when you're sighting in your crossbow, right? Because we all want to be shooting straight for this fall's hunting season. Eat shark. Very good. So guys, if you're interested in more videos about getting out and enjoying the great outdoors of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, be sure to check out the entire channel. And if you enjoy what you see, please consider liking and subscribing. And for bonus content, be sure to check out our Patreon page. A link to this page can be found in the description of this video. And also, guys, remember to hunt, fish, laugh, repeat. Thanks for watching, and God bless.